Nice to be here. I'm Ed. I work at Motability Operations. And we run one of the largest EV fleets in the country. And we provide a car to anybody who qualifies through certain allowances that are given out by central government. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are, and I'm going to talk a little bit about accessible charging and how you can design chargers for accessibility. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, although I'm not going to go too far into this because I'm in a room full of experts, on the opportunity we see around energy and EV and what that can mean for our customers in the future. So, first of all, who are we? So you might have heard of Motability or the Motability scheme. I'm from Motability Operations. I just want to explain this a little bit because it causes quite a lot of confusion. Motability is a charity with a mandate from government to provide a car scheme. The mandate says there's no competition. It also says we don't need that on vehicles, which gives us a competitive advantage. The reason why there's no competition is because it allows us to be really, really price competitive, and it also allows us to cross-subsidize people with more complex requirements and people who have no requirements at all, so we can offer a car to everybody. The whole idea of the scheme is universality. Motability Operations, who I work for, is the commercial entity that actually owns the vehicles. We spend about £8 billion on cars. We buy easily 1 in 10 this year. So far, it's 13% of all newly registered vehicles in the UK. And we own those assets outright, and we lease them to our customers. That's how the model works. So we take a car, we get discounts obviously with the volume that we're buying from manufacturers. We also don't pay VAT. And then the customers, so the people who get the allowance from government, the allowance they get covers the cost of depreciation essentially. So that makes a number of different vehicles affordable to people who wouldn't be able to get them on more traditional finance, and certainly not at the ticket and list price. Just while I remember, one really interesting thing we see about that is it's catching the DNOs out. So we are working with some of the DNOs in Northern Ireland because their models for EV adoption were being blown up, and they realized they were being blown up by our customers. So they were doing models based on demographics, and our customers were getting EVs much, much sooner than expected them to. About 40% of our customers have a household income of less than £20,000 a year, but they can afford the EV on the scheme. We have the Nissan Leaf and others for what we call zero advance payment. So they pay nothing in the dealership, and the allowance goes straight from central government to us to cover the cost. That means that EVs are starting to appear in areas where the infrastructure isn't necessarily there, and certainly central government and the DNOs, as I say, aren't expecting it to be there. So we're trying to engage more in that conversation and help by sharing our data to give more of an insight where that could be. So that's the sort of two different organisations. The other reason I point them out is because we're taking slightly different approaches to a fundamental problem around charge point accessibility. Motability, the charity, as I'll come to in a minute, has produced design standards, which is the PAS 1899 mentioned earlier, and we are trying to crowdsource data from our customers. So, to tell you a bit more about our scheme, we have 650,000 customers on lease, so that's 650,000 vehicles, actually slightly more than that. As I mentioned earlier, 13% of all UK car registrations in 2023. To give you an idea of what that means, 1 in 4 of every single Nissan, and 1 in 5 of every single Vauxhall is ours. And all our profits are reinvested. That's a really important point. So I mentioned we have no competition. We're owned jointly by 4 banks, 25% each. We pay no dividends. All the profits go back into the scheme. At the moment, that's a really important fact, because obviously our whole commercial model works on how much can we buy a car for, how much can we sell a car for. Used car prices have been absolutely through the roof. We target a roughly £100 million profit just as a sort of safety measure. For the last 2 years, we've made £1 billion of profit by accident. Now that money can't be spent on anything other than the scheme. So what that is going into is, number 1, the charity to provide grants to make vehicles more affordable, and number 2, affordability. So the supply chain problems that mean used car prices are high also means that the list car prices, the price we're buying cars at, are much higher. So we're investing in the difference and trying to keep prices down. And thirdly, electrification. So we've made a strategic choice to invest £300 million in enabling our customers to make the EV transition. So that's through things like creating artificial price parity and also supporting the installation of home chargers for free, for example, or subsidising public charging in some cases. So that's the sort of scheme overall. And I'm here today, so I'm from the innovation team. And we recognize that our model is going to have to fundamentally change as we move from ICE to electric vehicles. And also as the way that people get around changes fundamentally from a private car or an individual household to shared ownership of vehicles, micromobility, mobility as a service, a whole different range of things. And the way we're trying to do that is by partnering with organizations. So we're really open to quite fast-paced, small-scale pilots with pretty much anybody, to be honest. If we see a customer need and we think that there's a solution we can prove out. So we're trying to get out as much as we can and talk about what we do and find new partners. I've had some really interesting conversations earlier that hopefully will lead to something. So electrification, as I mentioned, is one of our 3 strategic pillars. Why do we care about that so much? Because, as I said, we buy new cars. So 2030, as things currently stand, as we all know, by 2035, our whole fleet will be electric vehicles. There's going to be 2.7 million disabled drivers by 2035. In terms of how many customers we could have, the number is slightly larger than that, because not all of our scheme customers would be able to drive themselves. A lot of them will receive the allowance, for example, someone who's visually impaired, and they can nominate a driver. So it could be an even higher number than that. But crucially for today and for the sort of energy ecosystem we're talking about, 50% of all of our customers we expect will have to rely on public charging. That's a sort of rough correlation from how many people have off-street parking. So getting public charging and the accessibility of public charging right is crucial. And lastly, as I mentioned, we're seeing huge demand for EVs on the scheme, probably because of that price parity we're investing in. So we're looking at about 1 in 4 applications at the moment. It's actually 1 in 5 customers tell us they want one, but at the moment we're seeing 1 in 4 applications are for EVs. So what does that look like? And I should just caveat this is a very crude projection, so don't read too much into it. And what does that mean, and why does that mean it's important for me to be at something like this? So if you look at a sort of rough projection through to 2035, where are we now? We're actually at 27,000 on the latest numbers, but about 4% of our fleet. If you just take the current appetite for EVs and take the lower number, so 1 in 5, by 2025 we'll have about 120,000 EVs. So it's a big fleet, and we think that's a big opportunity for us, but it's something we have to be investing in getting right now. Because to be honest, we missed the boat on public charging, and the infrastructure was being designed and built before we'd really woken up to the accessibility challenges. And so we're having to deal with a lot of retrofitting or a lot of understanding problems that already exist rather than trying to design them out from the beginning. So we're trying to get ahead of this fleet electrification and try and find the opportunities as soon as we can. We also think our fleet represents a really interesting opportunity. This is a crude extrapolation from the current ICE numbers that we see. If you take a typical fleet vehicle, 45,000 miles by year 3, typical consumer, 30,000, our vehicles, 20,000. So obviously, if you're thinking about the long-term value of the vehicle and the ways you can use an EV, fundamentally a massive battery and computer on wheels, if it's being used relatively little for driving, we think that creates big opportunities for wider grid services, particularly around vehicle-to-grid in the future. So, accessible public charging. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the research tells us about what the problems are. First of all, I guess perhaps most obviously, space around the vehicle is a huge issue. We understand that sites are space constrained and you've got to try and maximize the return on the investment you get. These are not cheap projects to do, but it makes them pretty much unusable in some cases for some of our customers. Now, not all of our customers are in a wheelchair or use a wheelchair most of the time, but a lot of them do have restricted mobility, and so the ability to open a door all the way is a really important factor. The ability to get around a charger easily is also absolutely vital. Related to that, but slightly different, is the sort of actual environment of a charger. Now, a lot of them are having bollards put in to protect them from crashes. Again, expensive infrastructure, understand why. But really seemingly small things, if you don't have accessibility needs, can be really problematic. So a very slight slope even, never mind a curb or a bollard, can be hugely challenging. And we also see infrastructure designed to stop cars rolling back into the infrastructure, really making it difficult for them, for our customers, to use it. The cable. This was talked about a little bit earlier, but this is a huge problem. What I think it is, though, also is an interesting example of the point that was made earlier about accessibility rather than designing for disability. If you look at some of the newer rapid chargers that are being deployed, the cable is tethered or supported just because it makes it easier for anybody to use, especially as the cables are getting longer to reach the different configurations and the bigger vehicles we're starting to see. But getting the cable weight right is something I think that makes it usable for some of our customers, but actually, I think it just makes it a much better user experience generally. And then dexterity and the challenge of using the charge point plug. So if you look on this one, for example, that you have see over there, I can't figure out, so we can get it out, but there's a handle on it, which means you can use it with one hand, which is really, really helpful. A lot of the adaptations we do to our vehicles are to allow people to control the vehicle on one side or the other with just a hand. And so enabling somebody to use this infrastructure with one hand is a really, really important barrier to overcome. Charging socket height, I suppose, is relatively self-explanatory. Again, an example where designing it right feels like it's better for everybody, but it makes it a usable piece of infrastructure for our customers. And similarly for the screens and the instructions more generally. Anybody who's used EV charging infrastructure will know it's not as sort of straightforward, if you like, as putting petrol or diesel in, where you don't really have to interact. You're selecting, you're pressing, you're starting, you're stopping, and so getting that right is really important too. And feedback, so making it really clear when the charger starts and when the charger stops, and making it less and less dependent where possible on using a screen for obvious reasons. But making sure, again, that feedback is designed in a way that is inclusive. So there are hardly any charge points, for example, with feedback loops for people who have hearing aids. So what are we doing about this? I mentioned the charities approach, which is the PAS 1899, which is a world-leading design standard. And when I say world-leading, I mean really that nobody else has lent into this and got into it as much as we have. One of the strange things about the Motability scheme is that it hasn't been copied anywhere else in the world. What it does is drive massive demand for vehicles, create turnover, and generally reduce the age of fleets. Japan hasn't done it, America hasn't done it, Germany hasn't done it. What it also means is there isn't the sort of organization like Motability, which has the scale to engage with someone like OZEV and get them on board with something like these design standards. So we're starting to see already these, which are currently British standards, being incorporated in tendering documents for some of the massive infrastructure spending that's going on in the US at the moment. So at a state and federal government level, we're starting to take this standard as a way of judging the accessibility of the infrastructure that's being proposed. So that's why I say it's a world-leading design standard. It was produced in consultation with industry, so charge point operators and the designers of this infrastructure, as well as the OEMs, were consulted and were really heavily involved, because we understand that it's not just as simple as making it perfect. We really want it perfect, the enemy of the good. It also includes guidance from the sort of rapid charging type infrastructure like this, all the way through to the on-street sort of more simplistic Ubertricities and connected curbs of this world, and how you can make that slow charge infrastructure accessible too. The last point I want to make, which I think is really, really important, I know what was being said about this charger earlier, and a lot of the design features are sort of in line with the guidance itself, but it is really important for me to say, and the charity have really asked me to emphasize this, there is a accreditation scheme coming in the autumn, which will be selecting specific partners who are then in a place to officially judge charge sites and charge infrastructure and charge designs as compliant or not compliant with the standard. So you will start to see a kind of kite marking process around accessibility based on these standards as we go into 2024. But there are no chargers that are officially compliant with the standard as yet. But we recognize that is something that people increasingly want to be able to do, and so we're trying to make sure the process is in place to do that. What are we doing at Motability Operations? So we've looked at the sort of current situation. We've got, as I said, 27,000 EV drivers on the road now. We know that charging infrastructure is going to roughly double between now and the end of the year, so this problem is not going away. So how can we solve it for the infrastructure that's already in the ground? We're trying to use our scale to crowdsource information about charge points and their accessibility from our customers, and then aggregate that. And our principles around that are that it will be open source, it will be available to anybody. So the ZapMaps of this world, the Electroverses of this world can have access to it, can display it, can use it in their platform. We only ask that they make it possible for people using their platforms to submit the data back. We also think there's some interesting opportunities around machine learning and the images we're collecting from customers to start to do this automatically. But for the time being, we built an MVP because no one else is doing this, and we were going to have to interrupt someone else's product roadmap to get it out there through a ZapMap or others. And we're obviously pushing this out to our customer base and starting to build momentum behind it at the moment. and it aggregates the data across a number of different categories based on that design standard. And also, we're starting to select for different features that we hear from customers that are more of a yes/no question, but really, really important to the decision around where they want to go and where they want to charge. So that's accessibility. I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about energy and EVs. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to go very into this because I'll display my ignorance very, very quickly. But just to sort of explain how we're thinking about it in terms of the now and the next. First things first, the biggest barrier for our customers of having an EV is the cost, whether that be the cost upfront or the cost of actually running it and owning it. Although, as you'll know, it's quite often cheaper than a nice vehicle. With the noise around energy costs and the sort of fear that can happen again, being able to reduce the actual cost of ownership is a really, really important thing. So we're focusing on trying to enable smart charging. The really interesting challenge for me here, and this had some interesting conversations earlier, is how do you do that for the 50% of people who can't charge at home? And I think that there are opportunities to do that. It just requires quite a lot of stakeholder management, quite a lot of hurdle jumping in terms of getting it off the ground. We've done some really interesting pilots with Trojan. We're going to try and do more where people are plugging into on-street infrastructure and they're taking their home tariff with them. So they're getting that dual rate on street, which I think is one really interesting solution. We're also working with Electricity to look at their smart charging proposition and see how we can make it easier and simpler for our customers to access. Then moving across, we obviously see an opportunity in grid services to sort of generate some revenue from these assets and pass that back to customers. As I mentioned, we've got no profit incentive, so we don't need it, we don't want it. And lastly, and I personally think most excitingly, vehicle to X, particularly vehicle to home, where we can potentially zero customers' bills, or vehicle to grid, where again we can generate revenue from the fact that that car is being driven a lot less than most other vehicles on the road, and it's also available at very asymmetric times. So it's not like our customers are following a absolutely typical gen pop demand curve. There's quite often opportunities to move the demand around, and our customers are there when a lot of other people aren't there. So we think there's some value in that in terms of vehicle to grid. So this is just to illustrate some of the partners we're working with. As I mentioned, everyone from Trojan and Electricity through to Hevo, who are wireless charging, EV Energy, sort of asset aggregators, Omea Charge Point, producer, Indra and Easy was saying, and Believe obviously also on-street infrastructure. So that's kind of the overview, but really I'm here to sort of have conversations with people and sort of find opportunities for us to pilot and test things. I don't know how long that was. Hopefully it wasn't half an hour. But if you've got any time, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see the sort of accessibility standard becoming legislation? Or is it always going to be guidance?
Yeah, it's, obviously that was the ambition. I think that I would hope it becomes legislation. I think that government is trying to balance the sort of necessity to get infrastructure in the ground against its accessibility. What we do see though, actually, is if you think about sort of full compliance versus sort of 80%, 90% compliance, a lot of the limitations are actually not coming from the CPOs, they're coming from the sites themselves. So it's just going to be a lot of work to try and change the actual physical reality of where they are, or just financially not viable. So I think what we've seen is by setting a gold standard, a lot of people are trying to get there. And that has really improved the design, particularly of public rapid infrastructure. But yes, long term, we are pushing for, and we hope it will be legislation. I think it's also becoming slightly legislation by the back door, in the sense that we understand that some of the coming tranches of funding for EV infrastructure, for charging infrastructure, sorry, for 2024, will probably have an accessibility weighting in the assessment process. So that, I guess, then starts to drive some of the uptake as well, where it is commercially viable rather than mandating it and potentially nipping things in the bud.
So there could be subsidies to help you achieve them, possibly.
I guess in a sense, yeah. I think what you might start to see is that if you have two competing bids with sort of same number of charges at the same speeds, but one of them is able to do that, meeting some of the pass standards or all of the pass standards.
Half the site being more accessible.
Yeah, so I think you'll probably end up in a similar situation. Yeah, rather than it all being accessible, but there will be some weighting that's applied in the same way that every parking space in any supermarket car park is not a disabled bay. But I think you will start to see where there's parity, the accessible sort of proposal for government funding certainly more likely to get funded.
And is it something you was going to fund anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, with the profits we've been making, it's something we've been thinking about.
Yeah.
The problem with it is that it's such a long-term investment, and it's a big, 25 years plus, and it's a volatile market, and it's a very fast-changing market, and we have to be quite risk-averse. So the money's really going back into the charity to fund accessibility through grants for vehicles.
With the subsidies on public charging, is that done through like a fuel card scheme or something like that?
So at the moment, it's all to do with trying to offer parity in the proposition. So if we can part fund the installation of a home charger, but you can't have a home charger, how do we make that fairer? So at the moment, it's not the charge itself, because obviously we don't provide subsidised petrol, but trying to strip out the transaction costs or the membership costs. And we are piloting we were using BP Pulse. We're now piloting a sort of aggregated scheme across loads more charge point operators. And what we're seeing with that actually is having conversations with charge point operators where they are willing to sort of think about discounts, and certainly are sort of drawn to the volume of people we can promise. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.